if you can join with us and connect with us virtually in our endeavor to bring some of the best brains in government, industry, civil society, academia, to discuss about sustainable technological solutions for various problems that rural and urban India faces. So the broad theme is technology for self-reliance, Atmanirbhar. And second one is socially relevant technologies. And the third one is technology and rural development. So today's webinar series is a talk by Dr. Niels Brimnes, who is an expert in colonial public health, history of colonial public health in India. And he's an associate professor of history in Aarhus University, Denmark. Today's talk will be on Halfdan Mahler in India, 1951 to 61, high modernist planning, social medicine, and the road to Alma-Ata. So today the moderator is Professor V.R. Muralidharan of IIT Madras, who is actually one of India's top health policy experts. And he's also the head of Center for Technology and Policy, IIT Madras. He has been part of many ministerial advisory committees, for example, for National Rural Health Mission. Then recently, last year, he was part of the committee or head of the committee that submitted a healthcare report to the government of Tamil Nadu, which was tabled in the Assembly of Tamil Nadu. So now I hand over the mic to Professor Muralidharan. Before that, I just want to give you the agenda for today's meeting. So it's like the last two times that we had exactly the same agenda. After my introduction, Professor Raghunathan Rangaswamy, the Dean of Global Engagement, IIT Madras, will welcome the moderator and the speaker. And then the speaker will be introduced by Professor Muralidharan, who is actually the Professor of Department of HSS, IIT Madras, Chennai. And then Professor Niels Brimnes will give a talk on Halfdan Mahler in India, high modernist planning, social medicine, and the road to Alma-Ata, followed by a discussion, which will be moderated by Professor Muralidharan. And finally, the closing remarks will be by Professor Karthik Raman, Faculty Advisor, Global Engagement, IIT Madras. See, the talk will be divided into two parts so that there'll be opportunity for the listeners to ask a couple of questions in the middle. Now I hand over the mic to Professor Raghunathan Rangaswamy, Dean of Global Engagement, IIT Madras. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudarshan. I welcome everyone who's joined this webinar. We're happy to see good participation in these webinars. I welcome Professor Niels Brimnes for doing this for us. We really appreciate it. And Professor Muralidharan for graciously agreeing to be a moderator for this. Thank you so much. Without taking much more time, I'll ask Professor Muralidharan to start proceeding. Thank you.
Good evening. This is Murali from IIT Madras, and welcome to this seminar webinar series. And also, in particular, today's webinar talk by Professor Niels, who has been our friend for more than 25 years. I've known him at least since 1990s. I have great pleasure in introducing both the topic and the speaker. I will go in the same order. I'll take a couple of minutes. Let me begin by quoting two paragraphs from the Alma-Ata Declaration Conference of 1978, which has been hailed as a landmark in the history of primary healthcare movement, not only in India, but across the globe. So the declaration consists of 10, I would say, broad guiding principles. I wish to quote two parts of it, paragraph 5 and 6. Every paragraph is important, every word is important, but I would like to choose these two, I think more in the context of today's topic, in particular, the individual and the context. So, Declaration 5, I quote, and I may pause here and there to highlight one or two key words or concepts. Declaration 5, quote, governments have a responsibility for the health of their people, which can be fulfilled only by the provision of adequate health and social measures. We notice the word government's central role. A main social target of governments, social international organizations, and the whole world community in the coming decade should be the attainment by all people of the world by the year 2000. This is the declaration made in 1978. By all peoples of the world by the year 2000, of a level of health that will permit them to lead a socially and economically productive life. This is a key line. And in the context of helping everyone attain a state of health that is attainable, that will permit them to lead a socially and economically productive life, the guideline 5 goes on to emphasize the role of the primary care, which is the key to attaining this target as part of the development in the spirit of social justice. End of paragraph 5. Now I quote paragraph 6. Primary healthcare is essential healthcare based on practical, scientifically sound, and socially acceptable methods and technology made universally accessible to individuals, and families in the community through their full participation at a cost that the community and country can afford to maintain. I underline, at a cost that the community and country can afford to maintain at every stage of the development in the spirit of self-reliance and self-determination. It is in this context we can understand how a topic of this nature fits the spirit of this webinar series. And I conclude the paragraph 6 with the following 3 lines. I continue. It is the first level of contact of individuals, the family, the community with their national health system, bringing healthcare as close as possible to where people live and work, and constitutes the first element of a continuing healthcare process. So I think it is, in a sense, we don't need to elaborate on this. At the same time, countries have spent years and decades on understanding the spirit of it in the form of designing and implementing primary healthcare system, their context. So it is in this context, in today's talk, we are going to listen to a particular individual by name, today's topic highlighting the role of an individual who made significant contribution towards the Alma-Ata conference, as well as in laying the foundation for primary healthcare, not only in India, but across the world. And who was born in Denmark, who worked in India as an officer, WHO officer of tuberculosis in India in the 50s and 60s, who learned also substantially from India, in India while being here, and carried his learnings back to international forum. So it is about that individual by name Halfdan Mahler, about whom today's speaker, Professor Niels, is going to talk about. And by way of introduction, I have pleasure in introducing Professor Niels, who is not a stranger to India. He has been visiting India for the last 25 years. His earlier work, his PhD work, was on early colonial European encounters with the communities in Coromandel Coast, which led to a book on a cultural practice called left hand and right hand rituals in temple rituals. Led to a book as well on the same topic. Later on, he began to work on history of medicine and healthcare in colonial India. Recently, he has published a book titled Languished Hopes, Tuberculosis, the State and International Assistance in 20th Century India, published by Orient Longman in 2016. As part of the work, he also worked extensively on history of BCG vaccination, which is also being talked about now today in today's context. Right now he's engaged in writing a full-length biography of Halfdan Mahler. So what he's going to present is part of that work, what Halfdan Mahler has done to conceptualizing the spirit and design of primary healthcare movement across the world. So with these preliminary words, I request now Professor Niels to present his talk. Over to you, Niels.
Thank you very much, Murali, for this kind introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this lecture series to commemorate Mahatma Gandhi. But what I will do first is that I would like to share my screen with you, and that is happening now. And I have a PowerPoint, which I will hopefully Yes, okay. So Halfdan Mahler comes down as one of the most prolific director generals of the World Health Organization. His name is closely associated, as Murali just explained, with the drive towards primary healthcare, a program he vigorously promoted during his 15-year tenure as Director General between 1973 and 1988. The main elements in primary healthcare can be summarized in 4 points, and you can also remember what Murali just quoted from the Alma-Ata Declaration. It is holistic in the sense that it links health issues to wider economic and social development. It emphasizes national planning in health, and it calls for community participation in health, and then it emphasizes the use of appropriate technology. The drive towards primary healthcare arguably culminated in a 1978 conference in Alma-Ata, then in the Soviet Republic of Kazakhstan, and the ensuing declaration of Alma-Ata, which Murali just quoted from. The drive towards primary healthcare has also been branded under the slogan "Health for All" by the year 2000. In this way, primary healthcare turns out as an alternative to sophisticated hospital-based healthcare for the privileged few, and also the technocentric single disease eradication programs that were characteristic of global health in the 1950s and the 1960s. Now, the primary healthcare idea or the primary healthcare movement can be contextualized in a number of ways. It can be contextualized within the challenges to the dominant paradigm of development after 1970. I'm here thinking of the call for a new international economic order from 1974, or the basic needs approach to development in general, which was sort of voiced by the World Bank in 1972, and then again by the International Labour Organization in 1976. I think that primary healthcare can very well be understood in the wider context of these ideas about what development should be. It can also be contextualized in the increasing skepticism towards biomedicine that also grew out of the 1960s and into the 1970s. I think we could refer to the biggest failure of the WHO, probably the biggest failure of the WHO, when they in 1969 had to withdraw from the ambition of eradicating malaria in the campaign based on DDT, and turn that program into a malaria control program instead of a malaria eradication program. That was in a way a major crisis for this single disease top-down campaign. Another aspect of the skepticism towards biomedicine was sort of a more philosophical kind. And I will just mention one book title. In 1975, the philosopher Ivan Illich published a book called Medical Nemesis, criticizing sort of sophisticated hospital-based medicine. This is another context of the primary healthcare movement, I think. And the final context is, of course, the Cold War. And it has been discussed in the scholarly literature about Alma-Ata, whether the fact that Alma-Ata was held in the USSR was in order to showcase the achievements of the Soviet Union in health services. But of course, there is a fourth context, and that is Halfdan Mahler himself, the man who more than anyone else was sort of behind this movement. Mahler is commonly described as charismatic, visionary, an idealist with radical ideas, and also as a highly controversial person. And then he was deeply influenced by his time in India in the 1950s as WHO medical officer to TB control program. As Socrates Listios has noted, and Socrates worked with Mahler in the WHO in the 1960s and 1970s on the primary healthcare issue. To quote from one of Socrates' articles, much of Mahler's thinking on WH's role can be traced back to his experiences in India. So, and that is what I'm going to go into more detail with this experience in India in the 1950s of Halfdan Mahler. How can that explain some of the features of primary healthcare and the Alma-Ata Declaration? So what was Mahler's experience in India? Well, Mahler was born in 1923 in Denmark and got his medical degree in medicine, his degree in medicine from the University of Copenhagen in 1948. Then as a very young doctor, he was 28 years old when he arrived in India as WHO senior medical advisor to the mass BCG vaccination campaign that was going on in India at that time. He stayed in that position for 4 years until 1955, and he was based mainly in Delhi during this time, although he traveled throughout India to supervise mass vaccination in each of the Indian states. He came back to India in 1958 or 1959, I'm not sure, as a WHO senior medical officer to India's national tuberculosis program that was based at the National Tuberculosis Institute in Bangalore. So for the second period in India, he was mainly based in Bangalore, and he left the NTI in Bangalore in 1961, late 1961, I think, to join the WHO headquarters and become chief of the tuberculosis unit there. Then, during the 1960s, he rose in the ranks and became elected as Director General in 1973. So, to go deeper into this idea about what features of Indian society could have shaped Mahler's views on health. And in this lecture, I'm going to suggest 3 features of Indian society in the 1950s that might have formed Mahler and shaped his view on health. First, India's high modernist belief in planning. Second, the prevailing discourse in India on social medicine. And finally, a people-centered view on health, which I think he might have encountered during his time in India. Okay, high modernist belief in planning. What do I mean by this? I take the concept of high modernism from James C. Scott. In his book, Seeing Like a State, he defines the high modernist ideology as a strong, one might even say muscle-bound version of the self-confidence about scientific and technical progress, which is unscientifically optimistic about the possibilities for the comprehensive planning of human settlement and production. I think this idea seems to describe post-independent India's belief in centrally planned, large-scale social transformation very, very well. So we go to India in the 1950s, we go to India of the 5-year plans. And we go to the India not only of the 5-year plans, but also of the lofty rhetoric accompanying them. The rhetoric conveyed a picture of a large enterprise and an almighty adventure to which every Indian could and should contribute. That is, large-scale social planning was a large enterprise and a mighty adventure to which every Indian could and should contribute. The rhetoric accompanying the India's 5-year plans sought to make the entire Indian population plan conscious. Thus, in December 1952, Nehru told the Lok Sabha that when I see these 2 heavy volumes of the report of the Planning Commission, my mind conjures up the vision of something vast, the mighty theme of a nation building and remaking itself. And 2 weeks later, in a New Year's address on All India Radio, Nehru urged the Indian population, let us all become partners in this great enterprise of building a new India. Another feature of the idea of large-scale social planning in India in the 1950s was that was the connection of rapid industrialization, or the goal of rapid industrialization, the systematic application of or through the systematic application of science and technology. As Nehru told the Indian Science Congress in 1948, it is through the method and spirit of science that we can ultimately solve our problems. Or as P.C. Mahalanobis said 10 years later, also to a congregation of Indian scientists, the only way out is through rapid industrial development based on planning and science. Mahler came to India in 1951, the year which marked the formal beginning of the first plan period, and he arrived, therefore, in a society increasingly permeated by the rhetoric of the benefits of large-scale social planning. And Mahler seems to have resonated very well with the notion of planning, and he seems to have been good at planning himself. The verdict of UNICEF Director of Field Operation, Brian Jones, in late 1953 was that the mass BCG vaccination campaign in India was highly successful, and attributed this to Dr. Mahler's initiative, enthusiasm, and painstaking care in planning. Mahler himself early and repeatedly expressed his belief in planning. Most clearly in his second report, back to the headquarters of WHO in Geneva and UNICEF in New York from 1954, in which he declared that mass vaccination with BCG had an important eye-opening effect on many public health authorities, especially in respect to the importance of detailed planning and military organization at all stages of a public health program. I think in this last quote, one might say that Mahler, the high modernist, is speaking. It was, however, one thing to praise planning in relation to the specific context of organizing mass vaccination. It was quite another to generally embrace the ideology of planning. And Mahler did gradually begin to refer to the larger promises of the 5-year plans, most clearly in his final report on BCG, which he submitted in 1954, shortly before returning to Europe. And he wrote in this final report, one should not forget that BCG, however insignificant in the total situation, is a 5-year plan project, and that its success hereby assumes added importance. Every 5-year plan project exceeding its target helps in boosting the confidence and fighting spirit of the people. BCG has definitely contributed its might within the realm of public health. In consonance with the prevailing narrative of plant development, Mahler here inserted mass vaccination as part of a much larger and laudable enterprise. BCG mass vaccination was a small wheel in a much larger machine, a great enterprise. So, after 4 years in India, Mahler appeared as a firm believer in the ideology of planning. In his official correspondence list, he did not question the rhetoric of the 5-year plans, nor did he express severe doubts about the feasibility of its goals. When Mahler returned to India in 1958 or 1959, his task was somewhat different. he was no longer charged with running a campaign that invited detailed high modernist planning and military organization. Instead, he was to participate in the much more inductive and investigative task of developing a new approach to tuberculosis control in India. Mahler and his colleagues at the National Tuberculosis Institute in Bangalore was to develop a national program based on the distribution of antibiotic drugs, which was the program both effective, applicable, and affordable under Indian conditions. This is the issue also coming up in the Alma-Ata declaration, to which Murali referred, that health has to be available at a cost that the people can afford. This was also the issue in Bangalore in the late 1950s in relation to TB control. In this context, Mahler's preference for planning was lifted to a more abstract level. A technical report from the NTI, the National Tuberculosis Institute, which must have Mahler as one of its authors, stated, "The development of health services in the privileged countries in Europe and North America has in many respects been haphazard and often very costly, both economically and in terms of human suffering and injustice. India believes in planning her future." A year later, another report from the NTI noted with approval that India has decided that its tuberculosis problem is to be tackled by one comprehensive plan, by a considerate and a decisive course of action by which the full value of knowledge may be achieved. No one could doubt that Mahler was increasingly sympathetic to and presumably also inspired by the high modernist course of social and economic development taken by India under the leadership of Jawaharlal Nehru and the Planning Commission. Now, this sort of ends the first part of my presentation, so I will stop sharing the screen and invite a few questions to this part of the lecture.
If there are any quick questions, we are not going to have a big break, but just 1 or 2 minutes if there is any.
There is actually a question in the Q&A box about the efficacy of BCG vaccine.
Yes, should I answer that?
It's up to you, Niels, if you want to take it up now or if it's a big question, so I leave it to you.
No, I will answer it. I can answer it very briefly, because we probably all know about the Chingleput trial, which was also, a South Indian, very important South Indian part of global health. In the 1950s and the 1960s, WHO and a lot of experts claimed that BCG afforded considerable protection against TB. But they didn't know it. And there were some evidence in support of the vaccine and some evidence notably from the global south, notably from India, against the vaccine. But it was not until 1968 that a major clinical trial was conducted. It involved 3.6 lakh of people, and it took 10 years. And in 1978, the conclusion from the Chingleput trial was that the protective effect of BCG against pulmonary TB was 0. So the WHO faced a major crisis because it had been advocating that vaccine for decades. And BCG is still given, but now it is given because it is believed that it is still very efficacious against some childhood forms of TB, but not the main form of TB, pulmonary TB in adults, which it was claimed to be, against which it was claimed to be protective.
Okay, maybe you can go ahead.
I will go to the second part of my presentation.
I suppose you can, yeah.
Yeah, I will just get the slides up. Just see how long. Maybe this is the one. Yes, okay. I think it works. Yes. Okay, I'll go to the second part, which is on social medicine. Now, This is the other feature of Indian society in the 1950s, which I think could have formed Mahler's views, the discourse on and debate about social medicine. Now, I understand social medicine as an approach to health, which insists that health is determined by larger social structures and inequalities. Social medicine is skeptical towards narrow technological fixes against single diseases, such as, you might say, BCG vaccination. Social medicine favors broad horizontal interventions in the environment. It favors sanitation, clean water supply, nutrition, and so on. It also favors simple technology, and it values popular cooperation in health. As you can see, there are many and striking similarities with the primary healthcare program of the 1970s. And in some books, you can also see that primary healthcare is basically labeled social medicine 2.0. Social medicine was not, however, a monolithic or uniform, completely uniform way of understanding health. It was a set of related approaches, and there were unsettled issues which were contested and debated between advocates of different versions of social medicine. One such issue was the position of highly skilled doctors. If the focus on basic health conditions through simple technology, if the focus is on basic health conditions through simple technology or through the application of simple technology, what is then the use of doctors trained in sophisticated clinical medicine? Another issue of debate was the inclusion of indigenous traditions of medicine. If social medicine solicits the active cooperation of the people, to what extent should we take their medical knowledge serious and consider it as a resource within our system of health? I'm just missing a piece of paper here, but that doesn't matter. I will say that in India, just after independence, there was a vigorous debate on how to organize the health services in the coming years, and social medicine played a pivotal role in these discussions. And the foundational document for these discussions was the report of the Boer Committee. That report was written during British rule, but I think everyone knew when they wrote it that they were in effect suggesting how to organize health services in a future independent state. It was published in 1946 and became, as I said, the foundational document for the discussions about public health and medicine in India. And the report came out as a very clear endorsement of social medicine. And I have here two quotes from that report, which shows that. It stated, for instance, at the outset, we must ensure that conditions essential for healthful living in town and countryside. Suitable housing, sanitary surroundings, and a safe drinking water supply are the primary conditions for securing such a measure of environmental hygiene as is essential to ensure the prerequisites of a healthy life. And in another part of this 4-volume report, it says, in the campaign for improved health, drugs, vaccines, and sera can in no way replace such essentials as a hygienic home, good food, fresh air, and a safe water supply. So these are very, very clear sort of statements in support of the idea of social medicine. Inherent in the vision of the Boer Committee was also the notion of a new doctor. In a lofty tone reminiscence of the rhetoric on planning, the report stated that the physician of tomorrow will naturally be concerned with the promotion of the new era of social medicine. But the committee was actually divided over the qualification of this new doctor. How well educated should the new doctor in New India be, so to speak? The majority of the committee argued that all new doctors were to be so-called basic doctors and hold a 5-year university degree, which in addition to clinical medicine must also include community, preventive, and ultimately social medicine. A minority, on the other hand, argued that the licentiate doctor with a shorter 3.5-year degree was an important indigenous feature of the growth of Western medicine in India. The minority accused the majority for blindly following the recommendations of the British Good Enough Committee, that is, blindly imitating and copying Western systems of medicine, while they suggested that India looked to the more relevant and apparently positive experience of the Soviet Union with less educated doctors, also known as feldsher's. When it comes to community participation, the Boer committee, there was no disagreement within the committee. The committee repeatedly and in consonance with the view, with the prevalent views within social medicine, emphasized the importance of securing the active participation of the population. The people had, as the committee wrote, to be aroused from their apathy, and a spirit of self-help should be created among the people through the development of cooperative efforts for the purpose of promoting curative and preventive health work. The urge to secure the cooperation of the people did not extend, however, to the incorporation of indigenous traditions of medicine. On these, the Boer committee had little to say, claiming that it was beyond its competence to comment on its merits. The committee accepted that indigenous medicine was influential, cheap, and that it might contain empirical knowledge of some value. But it also warned against promoting these traditions for reasons of patriotic pride. We do, however, the committee stated without any dissent, say quite definitely that there are certain aspects of health protection which, in our opinion, can be secured wholly, or at any rate largely, only through the scientific system, that is Western system of medicine. So to the Boer committee, it was out of the question to train the new doctor in indigenous medicine, nor did it advise that he or she paid much attention to it. But there was one exception to this rejection of indigenous medicine, and that was the Indian midwife, the SIDDHI. Around 1947, the rates for maternal and infantile death were so appalling and the need for midwives so great that the inclusion of the SIDDHI was deemed inevitable, if not in itself desirable. The SIDDHI was imagined as a figure that had to be won over for scientific medicine, and the committee advised to approach her with caution in order to overcome her background of, and I quote, ignorance and prejudice. The Boer committee's view on the SIDDHI neatly condensed the paternalistic attitudes towards indigenous medicine inherent in this particular version of social medicine. Now, the Boer committee was not the only voice promoting the views of social medicine in India around 1950. It is interesting to note how BCG vaccination was criticized by the energetic Madras-based former sanitary engineer A.V. Raman shortly before Mahler arrived in India. For 3 years, between 1948 and 1951, Raman almost single-handedly published the journal People's Health, which advocated what I would call a strong version of social medicine. Raman questioned the prophylactic value of the vaccine and found it to be a cheap technological fix that betrayed the more fundamental values of health held by both Gandhi and the Boer committee. While criticizing BCG mass vaccination in 1949, he wrote, "We would give the first and foremost priority to the improvement of nutritional and environmental conditions. The Boer committee has said so long before the Boer committee Mahatmaji said so." Raman's criticism exemplify how adherents of social medicine could be against public health intervention if they were too focused on a single disease or were too narrowly centered around specific technological solutions. Raman's invocation of Gandhi is, of course, interesting. Gandhi was both anti-vaccination and pro-sanitation. And it's easy to find statements from Gandhi to this effect. In 1913, for instance, Gandhi judged vaccination to be a savage custom. It is one of the poisonous superstitions of our times, the equal of which is not to be found even among so-called primitive societies. I personally feel that in taking this vaccine, the vaccine against smallpox, we are guilty of a sacrilege. In 1927, he told inhabitants in and around Trichy, all you need to do is merely to have a little bit of knowledge of sanitary science and a fixed determination to get rid of the evil which is undermining the health of our population. So the first quote, of course, displays Gandhi, the anti-vaccinationist, and the last quote displays Gandhi, the pro-sanitationist or the pro-sanitarian. Although I doubt that Raman actually shared Gandhi's religiously couched arguments against vaccination, it shows how the multifaceted voice of the Mahatma could be appropriated for a variety of purposes in post-colonial India. I should also mention that just as Mahler left India in 1955, severe criticism of BCG emerged again, and it again emerged from Madras. This time the main opponent was Rajagopalachari, but Rajati's aversion to mass vaccination came more, I think, from his suspicions of the interventionist, one is tempted to say, high modernist state than from a genuine position within social medicine. Now let's move to Mahler again. How did Mahler react to this discourse about social medicine that was very much alive in 1951 when he arrived? Well, by contrast to his immediate and wholehearted acceptance of the notion of planning, Mahler's relation to the agenda of social medicine appears more ambiguous. He did not address the broader assumption of social medicine until 1955 in his final report on BCG. Instead, his early report contained a remarkably sharp anti-doctor rhetoric. Mahler clearly had an aversion towards the clinically trained doctor, and he had it right from the beginning. I find that very interesting. He would describe these highly skilled but clinically skilled doctors as over or even super dignified, displaying a highbrow indifference to the simple medical operations involved in vaccination work. Half of the medically qualified team leaders in the campaign had, Mahler insisted, a positively harmful influence. And in his final report on BCG, he found it pleasantly amusing that in India, non-medical auxiliaries, after thorough training in a practical public health measure, do a better and more conscientious job than doctors. Another feature of Mahler's early reports was references to the potential of the Indian masses to take responsibility for their own health. In one of his early reports, he stated how the mass vaccination campaign had demonstrated that the active interest of the masses in their own health is easily roused when an enthusiastic approach is made. When first the rural masses realize and are able to formulate their demands for a healthier life, no power can deny it to them. In his final report on BCG, he concluded that the mass BCG project has, through mobilizing a wholehearted cooperation and understanding of the public, catalyzed the process, creating demands for more public health. Now, while references to the fundamental assumptions of social medicine were few and far between in Mahler's reports on BCG between 1951 and 1955, he did address these assumptions in his final report on BCG from 1955. He suggested that specific infectious diseases like malaria and tuberculosis were best understood as symbols of broader underlying problems, and that the greatest difficulties in promoting health in India was a lack of a genuine understanding of the social effects of public health problems. He continued, environmental sanitation is at a very low ebb in India. There's plenty of uninhibited coughing and spitting in India throughout all walks of life. The congestion of human beings in urban slums is extreme. Too few can afford an adequate intake of calories, and less would take trouble about a balanced diet. Mahler also suggested that any specific measure taken against tuberculosis might not be more important than raising the general standard of living. It seems that Mahler by 1955 was moving towards the ideas of health and medicine that were enshrined in the report of the Board Committee, were voiced through Raman's criticism of BCG, and which to some extent can be traced back to Gandhi. Now, the papers written from the NTI in Bangalore from the late 1950s, that is during Mahler's second stay in India, contained less explicit references to the issues featuring in discussions about social medicine. But Mahler might have picked up one more element that trickled into the primary healthcare approach, the ideal that health services should be seen from the people's perspective. In 1959, he met and employed the young Indian doctor Dibaba Banerjee. According to his recently published autobiography, Banerjee came to the NTI with the conviction that the central purpose of his life should be to subordinate medical technology to the people rather than the other way around. Banerjee quickly developed into a prominent figure in the sociological sections of the NTI, in which, according to a later NTI publication, for the first time, people's voices were placed on par with science, technology, and administration. According to Banerjee, India's national tuberculosis program came after intense academic discussions between Banerjee, Mahler, and the fellow Danish sociologist Stig Andersen to be built around the notion of the felt need of the people. To quote from Banerjee's autobiography, the arrival of data on tuberculosis as felt need or as a problem of suffering triggered intense academic exchanges between me and Andersen and Mahler, which ended in all three of us agreeing to the basic approach offered by this possibility. Now, it's difficult to measure the extent to which Mahler was influenced by Banerjee, but it is worth quoting an email Mahler sent to his Indian friend, because they did retain a lifelong friendship, in 2007, and which is also quoted in Banerjee's autobiography. "You still have many years to bless your pupils, and I am proud to be one of these." So Mahler, in his later years, clearly recognized that he had learned a lot from India and from Indian medical experts. So to conclude, what features of Indian society shaped Mahler's views on health and thus entered the discussions on primary healthcare in the 1970s? It seems obvious that the young doctor that came to India in 1951 immediately adopted the high modernist belief in large-scale social planning, an aversion towards sophisticated clinical medicine, and the emphasis on the importance of popular cooperation in health. More gradually and more ambiguously, he also adopted the notion that broad interventions in basic living conditions are more important than disease-specific interventions. And he probably also adopted the people or a people-centered view on health. Finally, a disclaimer. To argue that Mahler's views on health were significantly influenced by his experience as a young doctor in India is not to say that they were exclusively formed by it. So in order to understand Mahler properly, I need to consider how much of his upbringing in social democratic and post-war reconstructing Denmark impacted on his sympathy for planning. I mean, it was not only in India that large-scale social planning was conducted, it was also happening in Denmark after World War II. And I also have to examine the extent to which the ideas of social medicine were taught to him while he took his medical degree at the University of Copenhagen. My hunch is that he was not taught social medicine, but I have to check this. In any case, I think it would be fair to say that Mahler's ideas on health was extensively shaped by his experience in India, and that Indian notions of planning and of social medicine forms one of the many contexts of the drive towards primary healthcare and the Alma-Ata Declaration in the 1970s. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Niels, and I'm not going to make an attempt to summarize because we have only 15 minutes and we should allow people to ask some questions, except by one point, which he emphasized and is part of, which is a core to Mahler's view on the role of people and community in shaping the health of the people and designing the public health system. So may I just pick one or two questions from what we have already received, and then we move on. We have
Murali, there seems to be a large number of questions 18 some questions anyway.
Yeah, yeah. So in fact, I have got some questions forwarded by Sudarshan. So let me just begin somewhere. So there is a question on how much of Mahler's vision of primary healthcare impacted India's healthcare reform later. So that's a big question. And following that, there's also a specific question by the same individual. Did Mahler talk about pulmonary diseases that was also classified loosely as TB during his time of India? So that's a question. Maybe we'll begin with the first part of the question if you wish to.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think the first question, I think that maybe some of you will be better at answering that question than me. My impression also from looking at records in the WHO archives is that certainly in the 1970s, India would write reports about what they have done in terms of primary healthcare that would echo the views of Mahler very much. So I think there would be at least an understanding between, centrally placed health policy planners in India and Mahler in the 1970s. So I think that India was one of the countries that actually tried to implement this program, and that there was a certain degree of inspiration also. They seem to be very much on the same line, the Indian health authority, Indian government and Mahler in the 1970s. So I think there was, but I think that maybe you know more about it than I do, and I definitely should look more into this issue of what actually happened to this doctrine of primary healthcare. The other question about Mahler's interest in other pulmonary diseases, I can't give an answer to that because I have not noted that he was talking specifically about that.
Okay. There's another question on which you have touched upon, but the question is this. The WHO definition of health of 1948 had a lot of resonance with the Bore Committee report in India. Did this have any impact on Mahler and Alma-Ata declaration?
I think again that's a good observation, and I think that I could also have added that to the other sources of inspiration. That it is obvious that Mahler came. I mean, he came from the WHO. He came from an organization, and it is true that there are so many similarities. Between what is stated in the Boer Committee report and the official definition of WHO from 1948, that I think that this is certainly, this could also have strengthened Mahler's sympathy for primary health, for social medicine. It was not yet primary health care, but for social medicine, that, officially his organization held very similar views. Yeah, the interesting thing is, of course, that Mahler came to India as a representative of something slightly different. He came to India as a representative of a vertical single disease technologically based campaign. So that is sort of the paradox, or the irony is what Mahler did in India as in connection with the BCG.
Okay, here's a question. Since you are working on the biography of Mahler, you might be able to answer this. The question is, did Mahler in his later life had any critical views of the Indian policies on public health of the later years?
Yeah. I'm not sure about the Indian policies. I think that one of the interesting features about Mahler is that he became very disappointed with the way things developed after, especially sort of the advent of neoliberalism, also in global health in the 1980s. I mean, the conventional story is that shortly after Alma-Ata, some organizations, including the World Bank, including his former allies in UNICEF, including the Rockefeller Foundation, got together and invented another approach called selective primary healthcare, which the primary healthcare people in WHO saw as a huge betrayal of their ideals. And I think that Mahler fought for the last 10 years of his time as DG of the WHO to save his doctrine of primary healthcare. And he left WHO I think as a disappointed man, and he was disappointed with the advent of neoliberalism in health generally. But I don't know if he had any specific views on the Indian case.
So another question closely somewhat related to that, but then the light of your comment. The question is, Mahler was also an active participant in the first meeting of the People's Health Movement that took place in Dhaka in 2002. Have you had opportunity to examine how he followed the People's Movement in the last 10, 15 years of his life? Biography proceeded that far?
No, I have not, but I should. I mean, it's a very good observation that this movement, which I only know very little about it because I haven't looked into that part of his life yet. But it is my impression that there was here a movement where he could revive his ideals of the 1970s on primary health care, and that this People's Health Movement was well, that's again just my impression. It was a safe haven for him, someone who understood what he had been fighting for all his life. So that is as far as I am in his connection with that movement. But it is absolutely correct that once you go into his life, this association and his attendance in 2002 in Dhaka is a very important episode.
So there are many more questions. We have another few minutes. Maybe I will pick out a couple of more questions. This question is, I quote, "The importance of the shift from hospitalization of TB patients in sanatoriums to domiciliary treatment being equally effective. What are your views?" He's talking about nutrition, TB management, and the continued eclipsing of the role of nutrition. This is more like a remark, but you have a response to that.
No, but I will see. My response is that I think that that Mahler did participate in the early phase of designing the national TB program in India, which was based on domiciliary treatment with antibiotics, and that he. But I think that maybe Banerjee is a more important person here in the development of that specific program. But it was, of course, about looking at the at sort of the how this program was applicable, and I think that they probably forgot about the importance of, or found it difficult to incorporate let's say issues of nutrition in that program. The program was very much about should we actively find should we have active case finding or passive case finding. They opted for passive case finding because people, based on the doctrine of the felt need of the patient, they would come forward anyway. They would struggle to provide free drugs, which of course was a main thing in the program. And if they got free drugs, they often did not get enough free drugs to give multi-drug treatment, which was very important in order to avoid resistance. So I think the NTP, despite my fascination and sympathy with Mahler and Banerjee, I think the NTP had some flaws, which I've also written about in my book.
So I have a few more questions, but I would like to ask the organizers. It's now 7:30. So do you like me to stop here, or
maybe one more question, Murli, and then we can close, because lots of questions. There's someone who really wants a question answered, looks like. So I don't know if you can pick that out.
Wondering which one to pick.
I think it's one on indigenous medicine, I think, isn't it? Yeah. I would like. I'm very happy to that question. Now, the reason why I noted this is, of course, because it's interesting to what extent advocates for social medicine will also include in indigenous medicine, and will also look upon indigenous medicine as a resource. So I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting because the board committee is very negative towards indigenous medicine, except for the dye. But if you read the reports on primary healthcare, it is much more positive. The primary healthcare reports from the 1970s say, yes, indigenous practitioners can be used as a resource in primary healthcare. They contain valuable knowledge, they can be trained, they should be co-opted. Now, so I was interested in, did Mahler say any, did Mahler react to this? I mean, is there any, did Mahler in the 1950s during his time in India have any, say anything about indigenous medicine? The answer is no, or the answer is I haven't found anything from Mahler. But that is one of the differences between the social medicine of the Bohr Committee and the primary healthcare of Mahler and these 20 years, is that indigenous medicine was much more positively looked upon in the 1970s. But I can't use Mahler as a link there. I had hoped that I could, but I couldn't. The sources wouldn't let me.
So I see a number of friends who have worked extensively in India for decades, and someone has said that, can you say also something in the context of Gandhi's view on social medicine in today's context? So I'm going to request someone who we all know, and I'm sure you also know, Professor Iqbal, who is present here. Ask him to make one remark or in today's context at present as part of this concluding remarks. Professor Iqbal, I can see your name. Would you like to say something on behalf of all our friends here who are present here? Not here. Maybe I will then request Neil to make any grand statement on the importance of social medicine and as part of in the context of this webinar series and conclude.
Yeah.
Like,
well, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much.
You alluded to. Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
I will just say that I think that the wider purpose of this the theme that I've talked about is, apart from trying to write up a chapter of a book that would hopefully come out in some years' time, in which I'm also writing with two colleagues, where I'm sort of, because I know about the 50s, I'm sort of in charge of the early parts of Mahler's life, or mainly in charge. So it's trying to see what could go into a chapter on Mahler in India in the 1950s. But also I think that it is also to see it's also to find some kind of missing link between, now social medicine was a big thing in the 1930s and the 1940s, and there was a big conference on rural hygiene, which is basically the same as social medicine, in Bandung in 1937, and it has been extensively studied by historians of medicine. And then there is this big conference in Alma-Ata in the 1970s, that is 40 years later, and they are strikingly similar, because the things they said about social medicine in Bandung, they say a lot of the same things in Alma-Ata. Now, what is the connection? And I think that one connection, one attempt to link these two, social medicine 1.0 and social medicine 2.0, that might be an Indian connection. They might be linked through the person of Mahler, or not the only link perhaps, but one of the links might be the person of Mahler and what he experienced and heard and learned from India and from the report of the Bohr Committee and so on and so forth, while he was in India as a very young man in the 1950s. I think that is sort of one of the bigger things that I want to with this lecture.
Okay, so there are many more questions. Particularly, people are anxious to know Mahler's role and association with community and civil society organizations, and I think probably your book will deal with that as part of your biography on that. There are many people who have asked, curious about your remark on his engagement with the civil society. So I will just highlight that as an important part, not only of your work, but of Mahler's concern in life. And I will now hand over the podium to Professor Sudarshan and conclude.
Yeah, this is Raghu. Thank you very much, Professor Niels. It was a fascinating seminar. I myself learned a lot of new things here, and the kind of engagement that we have seen in terms of questions and so on. It's really heartening. Thank you so much for a wonderful webinar. And Murli, thanks very much for comparing this. And Sudarshan, if you have any final words, please go ahead. Otherwise, I thank everyone for coming here.
We just want to thank the audience and thank Professor Niels Brimnes and also Professor Muralidharan for a very, very illuminating talk. Thank you very much.
I would also like to say thank you to Murali, to the organizers, to Sudarshan. Thank you very much. This is one of the good things about what has happened recently, that we have learned to do these things. There are many bad things about how the world looks at the moment, but yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Niels.
We have Sudarshan on first the October series. You want to say something?
Yeah, please. We have a health and environment week for Gandhi Jayanti, 4 days. So there'll be 4 webinars, important webinars on Professor Muralidharan is chairing another panel on universal healthcare in India. Then there'll be 3-4 lectures on environment, water management, pollution. So we'll be advertising. So please do attend these webinars. It's going to be very interesting, excellent panelists. So we'll see you during October 1st week. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody. Thanks.